Hello and welcome to the Transmission Facilitation Program Solicitation Informational Webinar. I'm Whitney Bell with ICF and I'll be your host today. First, a few housekeeping items for today's webinar. This WebEx meeting is being recorded and may be used by the U.S. Department of Energy. If you do not wish to have your voice recorded, please do not speak during the call. If you do not wish to have your image recorded, please turn off your camera or participate by phone. If you speak during the call or use a video connection, you are presumed to consent to recording and use of your voice or image. All participants are in listen-only mode. If you have any technical issues or questions, you may type them in the chat box and select Send to Host. We are taking questions today, and you may submit them throughout the event using the chat function. We will have Q&A after the end of the presentation. If you need to view the live captioning, please refer to the link that will appear in the chat now. Finally, we will post a copy of today's presentation on the Transmission Facilitation Program webpage by Friday. The recording of today's webinar will be available in about 2 weeks. So let's go ahead and get started. Today you'll hear from Maria Robinson, Director of the Grid Deployment Office, for some keynote remarks. I'll turn this over to you, Maria. Welcome.
Thank you so much and appreciate everyone joining us today. My name is Maria Robinson. I head up the Grid Deployment Office. We are one of the new offices here at the Department of Energy. Thanks to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and now, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, we are focused on deployment of all sorts of different grid technologies, including but certainly not limited to transmission and distribution technologies here. And so I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction on the next slide about the type of work that we are doing here. We are largely focused on deploying technologies across the entire grid system in order to increase overall reliability and resilience. We do that through 3 different divisions, the first of which is the Power Generation Assistance Division, which focuses on hydroelectric and nuclear existing assets. What you'll hear about today is the Transmission Division, which continues to grow in scope on a near daily basis. In terms of the type of work that we're doing, which includes terrific new financial tools and capabilities, including today's Transmission Facilitation Program. The third office is the Grid Modernization Office that focuses on a number of different competitive and formula grants, as well as some of the work that we do here at the Department of Energy around the territory of Puerto Rico. So we're really excited today to have all of you join and your interest in the Transmission Facilitation Program, and in particular, this first anchor tenant related RFP. We're sure there are plenty of questions, and we look forward to helping to provide additional information moving forward here as well. So Whitney, with that, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Maria. We now welcome Jeffrey Dennis, Deputy Director, Transmission Development of the Grid Deployment Office, for his presentation on the Transmission Facilitation Program capacity contracts. Jeff, welcome. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. My name is Jeff Dennis, as was just mentioned, Deputy Director of Transmission Deployment here in the Grid Deployment Office. If we can go to the next slide, let me add my welcome. And as Maria mentioned, today we are going to discuss and provide an overview of our first release of a request for proposals in the Transmission Facilitation Program, this one for capacity contracts. Next slide, please. A reminder that to please note that none of the information we present today is legally binding. This presentation is for informational purposes only. And in the event of any apparent discrepancies between this presentation and the RFP controls. So please carefully read those RFP guidelines and adhere to them as you move forward and potentially submit an application. Next slide. Here's a little overview of what we'll present today. First, we'll provide an overview of the Transmission Facilitation, or TFP program, as I'll probably call it a lot, describe the evaluation criteria and review process DOE will use to assess applications for capacity contracts under the recently released RFP, provide an overview of some of the materials applicants are required to submit, and discuss next steps for the TFP program. We'll leave some time for questions as well. Next slide. So let's begin with an overview of the Transmission Facilitation Program. Next slide. Congress enacted the TFP as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law signed into law by President Biden in November of 2021. TFP is intended to help facilitate the development of new and substantially upgraded transmission lines by addressing common commercial hurdles that can stall those lines or cause them to be constructed with less capacity than is optimal to meet future needs. The TFP is a revolving fund, so part of DOE's analysis under this program is to assess its ability to recover its investments and replenish that fund so that it can continue to be used. The TFP includes 3 primary facilitation tools described on the right side of this slide. Capacity contracts, which we will discuss today, which are allow the department to buy up to 50% of a planned line's rating for up to 40 years, and then remarket that capacity to recover our costs and replenish the Transmission Facilitation Fund. Public-private partnerships are also available within a national interest electric transmission corridor, necessary to accommodate an increase in electricity demand across more than one state or transmission planning region, and loan authority program is also available. But as we'll discuss today, this first request for proposals is focused on using one of those tools, capacity contracts, to facilitate the timely construction of shovel-ready projects that can begin construction by the end of 2027. This program is designed to support projects that would not otherwise be constructed or be constructed with less capacity without federal facilitation. Next slide, please. So to get more specific here, to be eligible for support under TFP, a project must be an eligible project. And eligible projects are defined in the statute as the construction of a new or replacement transmission line of at least 1,000 megawatts, the upgrade of an existing line or construction of new line in an existing infrastructure corridor of at least 500 megawatts, or the connection of islanded microgrids to existing transmission, telecom, or transportation infrastructure in Alaska, Hawaii, or U.S. territory. In addition, Congress required that DOE under the TFP program prioritize projects that use technology that enhance the capacity, efficiency, resilience, or reliability of an electric power transmission system, improve the resilience and reliability of an electric power transmission system, facilitate interregional capacity to support strong and equitable economic growth, and contribute to subnational goals to lower electricity sector greenhouse gas emissions. As I mentioned earlier, DOE must also have a reasonable expectations that programs from the proceeds from the eligible project will be adequate to recoup funds and replenish the Transmission Facilitation Fund. Next slide. To summarize then, to move forward with an eligible project, DOE must certify that the eligible project is in the public interest, that it is unlikely to be constructed in a timely manner or with as much transmission capacity in the absence of facilitation provided under the TFP, and that there is a reasonable expectation that proceeds from the eligible project will be adequate to recover the cost. Next slide. The RFP we're discussing today was informed by comments received in June of this year in response to a request for information issued in May of 2022. Moving forward, initial proposals in response to the RFP will be due February 1st. As I will explain in more detail today, selected applicants will be invited to submit additional information in Part 2, where finalists will be chosen to enter the due diligence phase and negotiate a capacity contract. Next slide. Now let's dig into how DOE will evaluate and review proposals and the criteria we'll use to determine which proposals move forward in the process. DOE will use a 3-step evaluation and review process to select projects to support from the broad set of applicants that respond to this RFP and provide a Part 1 application. This process is detailed in the RFP and summarized at a high level here. In Part 1, applications are screened for eligibility and readiness, then evaluated against core program criteria, specifically need for the capacity contract and readiness to commence construction by the end of 2027. DOE will select a subset of projects based on this evaluation and invite them to submit more detailed information in Part 2, where projects will be evaluated against additional statutory and policy criteria and vetted further. From there, finalists will be selected, and DOE will conduct due diligence and contract negotiations with this smaller set of projects out of the initial applicants. Next slide. To provide additional detail on Part 1, after the initial screen for eligibility and readiness to commence construction by the end of 2027, projects will be evaluated or scored against 2 key criteria. 1, whether a capacity contract is needed. That is, whether it is unlikely to be constructed in as timely a manner or with as much transmission capacity in the absence of federal TFP support. And 2, whether it is reasonable to expect that proceeds from the proposed project will be adequate to recover the authorized TFP support. The highest scoring applicants will then be invited to Part 2. In Part 2, DOE will evaluate applications against 3 main criteria. 2 that are familiar from Part 1, need for TFCP support and likelihood of repayment, and a 3rd criteria designed to assess whether the project will be in the public interest. These criteria are weighted roughly equally. Next slide, please. To dig in a little bit more to that public interest criteria, DOE will assess whether a project is in the public interest based on a combination of the statutory priorities established by Congress in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the benefits the project will produce for communities, including the extent to which the project will provide good quality jobs, advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and contribute to the administration's goals set forth in the Justice 40 initiative to ensure that project benefits are distributed to disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. Based on the Part 2 evaluation, DOE will select finalists to enter into a due diligence and contract negotiation phase. During this phase, DOE will be working with third parties to validate and verify information provided in Part 1 and conduct a risk analysis. DOE may then enter into negotiations with one or more applicants to set the terms of an awarded capacity contract. Next slide, please. Now that we've reviewed the evaluation and review process DOE will use, let's discuss the information applicants are required to provide in each part of that process, with a focus on what is required during Part 1. Next slide. First, here are some overall tips for proposal submission. Please follow the procedures in the RFP and use Appendix A in the RFP as a guide and a checklist for relevant appendices and specific information to submit. It's a good practice to label your responses indicating the corresponding appendix section that you are responding to. Ensure that information is supported by robust and transparent data and responds to the specific requirements of the RFP and appendix. Make sure that data is up to date and that it is consistent across the questions. And ensure your application materials are complete and specific to the criteria being assessed. Next slide, please. So turning to Part 1, to demonstrate project eligibility and readiness under the screen applied here, next slide, please. Applicants are asked to detail whether their project is in a new or existing corridor and whether its proposed capacity matches the program requirements. Specifically, is it 1,000 megawatts or more in a new corridor or 500 megawatts or more in an existing corridor? In addition, to allow DOE to assess readiness, applicants are asked to provide ownership and equity structure information, an organizational chart and description of key staff, and a description of other entities that are expected to play a material role in constructing the project. Applicants are also asked to provide information on readiness to receive equipment and major components, whether interconnection agreements, land rights, state and local clearances, and necessary environmental clearances have been received, or their status if not, along with a description of any obstacles encountered, plans in place to address and mitigate commercial and financing risks, including cost risks, and a timeline of milestones to be achieved to commence construction by the end of 2027. Applicants are also asked to describe any pending litigation impacting the project. Next slide, please. Next, to demonstrate the capacity contract is needed and the likelihood of repayment once that initial screening is done. Next slide, please. Applicants are asked to provide an explanation of why the proposed project is unlikely to be built or unlikely to be built with as much capacity or in as timely a manner without support from the TFP program. Including a description, applicants here are asked to include a description as well of how the proposed capacity contract would encourage other entities to enter into capacity contracts for the proposed project, how it would mitigate or eliminate financing or cost recovery barriers that may be preventing the project from moving forward, and how it will allow the project to begin construction, and how such a contract would accelerate commencement of construction or spur an increase in capacity in line with the program goals. In addition, applicants are required to qualitatively and quantitatively articulate the market conditions and other factors that bear on DOE's ability to expeditiously market, transfer, or relinquish its contracted transmission capacity, with revenues sufficient to recover its costs under the capacity contract. This includes providing modeling, pro forma financial statements, and other information showing expected demand for the capacity and expected revenues from marketing, transferring, or relinquishing that capacity. Finally, applicants are asked to provide a term sheet specifying material terms and conditions, including the amount of capacity proposed for DOE purchase, the contract term, and the rates for that capacity. Please see the referenced appendices in this slide for more detailed information on these submission requirements. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, projects that score the highest in the Part 1 evaluation will be invited to submit a Part 2 application with additional information. DOE structured the submission process in this way to ease the burden of initial applications and to ensure that a subset of projects most likely to move forward would be asked for this more detailed information in Part 2. Applicants will be notified of whether they were selected or not, and those that are invited to Part 2 will have 45 business days to submit additional required materials. Next slide, please. Let me provide a brief overview of what comes next for projects invited to Part 2. Next slide. Those applicants invited to Part 2 will be required to provide additional information to validate the threshold determinations in Part 1, including an independent market report providing an assessment of whether and when the proposed project will be fully subscribed, and the likelihood that DOE will recover its costs under the proposed capacity contract. Much of the additional information required in Part 2 relates to the statutory priorities and policy factors that DOE will use in its Part 2 review as criteria to determine whether a project is in the public interest. This includes information related to those statutory priorities enacted by Congress that we talked about earlier, including how technology is planned to be used to enhance the capacity, efficiency, and performance of the proposed project, including the use of advanced technologies for these purposes. Second, how the project will improve reliability and resilience by, for example, hardening a system against storms, or severe weather and climate-driven impacts. Third, how the project will facilitate interregional transfer capacity that supports strong and equitable economic growth in those regions. And fourth, how the project will contribute to national or subnational goals to lower electricity sector greenhouse gas emissions, including greenhouse gas emissions in the load centers that will be served by these projects and receive the electricity that they transmit. Importantly, applicants invited to Part 2 will also be required to submit a community benefits plan, detailing their planned approach to ensure that the federal investment in the proposed project will advance community and labor engagement objectives, invest in the American workforce and create high-quality jobs, advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and contribute to the Justice 40 initiative goals of ensuring that a share of the anticipated benefits of the project flow to disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. Additionally, the statutory language creating the TFP requires DOE to consult with relevant transmission planning regions before entering into a capacity contract to compare the transmission needs identified by those regions in their planning and minimize, to the extent possible, duplication or conflict when selecting projects to support with federal facilitation through the TFP. DOE plans to engage in this required consultation before finalists are selected to move to due diligence and contract negotiation, but may consult with regions earlier in the evaluation process to inform the selection of projects that move forward to additional stages of the review process I've described today. Next slide, please. During that final due diligence phase for projects that are selected to move to this phase, DOE will work with third parties to validate data that has been submitted, stress test modeling scenarios to verify demonstrations and determinations regarding the likelihood that the project will generate revenues sufficient to repay the federal investment. It will verify permitting and stakeholder engagement that was demonstrated in the application materials to ensure and validate that the project is ready to commence construction in the required timeframe. Identify financial and other risks and mitigation strategies that are in place to address those risks and account for them. And ultimately to negotiate a capacity contract with key terms, including, as I mentioned earlier, the amount of capacity, the rates, and the related terms and conditions of taking that transmission service. Next slide, please. Let's quickly discuss other TFP program work and then address some questions. Next slide. While this first RFP focuses on capacity contracts, future RFPs may include a combination of this tool and other facilitation tools provided by Congress in the TFP. These include public-private partnerships, as well as loan capability. Microgrid connection projects in Alaska, Hawaii, and US territories may also be the subject of future issuances, although they are not the subject of this particular RFP. Next slide. We have several additional resources on our website to help you better understand this program and prepare applications, including a frequently asked questions that we will update as questions come in so that all potential applicants have the same information. There's also a fact sheet and our grid and transmission programs conductor, a tool that can help you sort through all the transmission and grid resilience financing programs that have been made available under President Biden's Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, as well as under other existing DOE programs. Next slide, please. And with that, I believe we are ready to turn to some Q&A.
Thank you, Jeff. You are correct. So let's go ahead and get started. Please note if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll do our best to answer them. And And before we jump in, just a reminder to everyone that we'll post a copy of today's presentation on the Transmission Facilitation Program webpage by Friday. And the recording of today's webinar will be available on the same page in about 2 weeks. All right, let's jump into our first question here. Why is DOE proceeding with an RFP for capacity contracts first?
Sure. So this capacity contract authority or anchor tenant authority gives us the ability to be a source of contract revenue, and that's very unique to the transmission facilitation program. DOE is seeking to move quickly to help spur transmission deployment and operations through this RFP for capacity contracts. Loans and public-private partnerships, those other tools that were provided in the TFP, are currently available through other existing DOE program offices, such as the Loan Program Office, Western Area Power Administration's Transmission Investment Program, and other programs, but they may not spur transmission deployment as quickly as they generally require longer lead times when compared to capacity contracts. We think capacity contracts can enable the program to have an impact sooner on those shovel-ready projects I talked about, while allowing us time to tailor future program offerings to meet future and more in-depth transmission development needs.
Great, thank you. Our next question. What environmental and energy justice goals is the TFP RFP designed to achieve?
Sure. So in keeping with the administration's goals, and as a federal federal agency, whose mission includes strengthening our nation's energy prosperity, DOE is seeking eligible projects that not only contribute to the country's energy technology and climate goals, but also promote additional goals, including creating good-paying, high-quality local jobs, advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility for all, including people of color and others who have been historically underserved, marginalized, and adversely impacted by persistent poverty and inequality. We also want to support meaningful community and labor engagement and contribute to that goal that the president has set, that 40% of the overall benefits of projects supported by federal funding flow to disadvantaged communities. That's the Justice 40 initiative I referenced earlier. To assess how proposed projects will contribute to meeting those goals, the RFP requires the development of community outreach plans by applicants who are invited into Part 2 of the review process, as I discussed earlier. Community outreach plans will be required to demonstrate a strong commitment to engagement with a wide range of local stakeholders, such as labor unions, local governments, state energy offices, tribal governments, and community-based organizations that support or work with disadvantaged communities. Proactive engagement with all of these stakeholders can lead to stronger projects and better outcomes, increased transparency, and the reduction or elimination of associated risks that can often stall transmission projects before they can be constructed.
Our next question, what entities can apply for these contracts?
Any entity that's seeking to construct an eligible project can apply for capacity contracts. So there's a number of programs available through the bipartisan infrastructure law that restrict eligibility to certain types, but TFP has open eligibility in terms of the type of entity that can apply for facilitation, so long as the project they are seeking support for meets the eligible project definition in the statute. And to repeat that project definition, it is an electric power transmission line that is capable of transmitting not less than 1,000 megawatts, and upgraded to an existing transmission line, not less than 500 megawatts, or the connection of an isolated microgrid to existing infrastructure corridors in Alaska, Hawaii, or a territory of the United States. Proposals to connect an isolated microgrid to an existing transmission or telecommunication infrastructure in Alaska, Hawaii, or a territory are not being sought in this RFP because capacity contracts do not align well with the ownership, technical, and commercial characteristics of those projects. But again, microgrid projects are expected to be considered in future solicitations.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. Our next question, does TFP help speed the development of needed transmission projects, including with permitting?
TFP contracts are not designed as a tool to assist with local, state, or federal permitting requirements. Rather, they are a tool that Congress provided to help provide near-term revenue certainty to projects. And this provides opportunities to support eligible projects that need that near-term revenue certainty to construct the project or to add capacity that is anticipated to be needed in the future. And so, for example, projects that do not have a guaranteed source of rate recovery or cost recovery through a regulated rate or tariff may need that kind of revenue certainty in the near term to proceed to construction. These are the kinds of commercial hurdles that the TFP was designed to address. So again, capacity contracts are designed to provide that revenue and financial commitment for energization of the new transmission line faster and potentially a greater capacity than the market might otherwise support, while ensuring that DOE can recover its expenditures, replenish the transmission facilitation fund, and support additional projects in the future.
Thank you so much. Another question just came in. Can a TFP capacity contract be used for reconductoring projects or advancing conductors? Or I'm sorry, with advanced conductors?
Yes, absolutely. TFP contracts can be used for upgrade projects, including reconductoring, if they meet that definition of an eligible project, which I discussed earlier in response to questions and during the webinar. The Grid Deployment Office is aware of significant interest in reconductoring with advanced technologies as a means to increase the transmission capacity of existing corridors. And so I want to note that there are other programs available through the Grid Deployment Office that may also be of interest to entities out there that are interested in reconductoring. We encourage you to visit that Grid and Transmission Programs Conductor I mentioned earlier, which is a clearinghouse for financing programs made available through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as other existing DOE transmission and grid programs. So visit that website. You can learn more about that program, those programs, and the potential for them to be used for reconductoring. And also keep an eye on that website for additional funding opportunities in the future.
And I believe we just dropped that link right in the chat for everybody. So they can
Terrific.
access it there.
Great.
We have another question just came in. Is there a cap on the amount of the $2.5 billion that can be dedicated to capacity contracts in this round? It's kind of a two-parter. It said, will there be a specific set aside for loans and or PPPs?
We are currently determining how much of the program we will use for capacity contracts in this first round. And it, of course, really will depend on the scope of the projects we get, on how many of them are eligible, and how they, our assessment of how they contribute to the program goals that Congress laid out in the TFP. We expect to offer additional funding opportunities and announcements in the future, as I mentioned earlier, for not just capacity contracts, but also public-private partnerships and loans. Also, as I mentioned, for microgrids. So while we don't have a specific set aside in mind, we do expect and are planning to issue future solicitations in this program.
Great. Can you explain how you will consult with regional authorities? Our plan is to reach out to regional authorities, as I mentioned, before selecting projects to move forward to the due diligence phase, which is, of course, that final phase where we expect to then enter into contract negotiations. That will involve, of course, a regular outreach really to those folks to make sure that we understand what's in their plans, needs that they have identified in their plans, and how those needs compare
to the needs that would be addressed by that project. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the goal is to engage with these entities as needed, but at least before we select finalists, to avoid, to the maximum extent possible, any kind of duplication or contract or conflict between projects that we support through the TFP and projects that may be moving forward in a relevant transmission planning region. That all is consistent with the statutory requirement, which requires the Secretary to consult with relevant transmission planning regions before entering into a capacity contract to regarding the transmission planning region's identification of needs. So that's what we're thinking at this point. And I think there'll be obviously more to come as we work through.
All right, a couple more questions have come in while you're answering that one. It was perfect timing. Also, you mentioned the forthcoming RFPs will be issued implementing other BIL and IRA programs. When do you expect to issue additional guidance on the public-private partnership provision?
We don't have a specific time frame at this point. We're engaged in scoping our additional authorities under the transmission facilitation program. So unfortunately, I can't offer a specific date, but I can say that we are assessing those opportunities and assessing what kind of issuances we can put forward in the future.
Great. To what extent will the program favor transmission that delivers renewable power?
Thanks for that question. In identifying projects to support under the TFP, Congress included a number of priorities, certain objectives that we need to prioritize in selecting projects. One of those is whether the project contributes to meeting national or subnational goals to lower electricity greenhouse gas emissions. But in terms of how we will go through identifying those projects, of course, as I mentioned earlier, eligible projects must demonstrate that they are sufficiently viable to enable DOE to remarket this capacity and recover its costs in a timely manner, to replenish the TFP revolving fund and offer support to additional projects. And within that broader mandate that Congress has given us to accelerate the delivery of transmission service projects, the statute directs us to prioritize projects that promote the public interest by delivering beneficial grid outcomes to the maximum extent possible. And I mentioned many of these earlier. It includes enhancing capacity, efficiency, resiliency, or reliability through the use of advanced technology, facilitating interregional transfer capability, and again, contributing to national or subnational goals to lower electricity sector greenhouse gas emissions. So all of those statutory priorities that are in subsection J8 of the statute, if you're looking at it, will be considered together in selecting projects. Along with, I should mention those policy priorities around community engagement, jobs, and contributions to the Justice 40 initiative that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. That was quite a thorough response. I appreciate it. Will there be more rounds of solicitation for the capacity payments, or will future solicitations only be for other programs like loans, public-private partnership, et cetera?
We're considering all options and opportunities for future solicitations, and they could certainly include capacity contracts in addition to public-private partnerships and loans. Again, I think much of that will be determined by our ongoing assessment of our opportunities for those other types of facilitation, as well as our assessment of the applications that we receive in this first round under the RFP. But it is certainly possible that we will include capacity contracts in a future solicitation as well.
All right, and I think this is potentially our last question here, unless something else comes in while you're answering. But where can we get additional information? Has a designated POC been chosen?
Yes, I believe so. And I think I probably am going to need to look at the website for that quickly while we're on the phone here. But additional information, this slide presentation that you will see posted, as well as the website that was just put into the chat, has all of that additional information I talked about, including a set of frequently asked questions that we will update as we get more questions like the ones we heard today. So that all potential applicants have the same information. And there are points of contact listed on that website as well. So if you follow those, you can get more information on all of the various parts of the TFP, how you can submit requests for additional information to a point of contact. And again, I will mention the RFP and the appendices there too are quite thorough. Our team here did a really excellent job in laying all of those out. So definitely take a close look at those as well. I think they will answer a lot of questions and provide a lot of detail.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for those excellent questions and discussion. This does wrap up all of our questions and today's webinar. If you have any comments or questions for the transmission facilitation RFP, you can email us at the email address that was just dropped in there, transmissionfacilitation@hq.doe.gov. Thank you to Maria and Jeff for joining us today, and thank you to all of our attendees for participating. Take care, everyone, and we will see you next time.